Okay, good Erev Shabbos. This week we have the privilege of beginning our annual journey through the book of Devarim. So one of the unique features of Sefer Devarim is that as the ancient Hebrew name Mishneh Torah, a repetition of the Torah, implies that one of the elements that we find in the Sefer is a review of some of both the episodes and mitzvos that have been already presented earlier in the Torah. But there are, when we come to these repeat episodes, there are three what I would call new features. So the first thing is just in the retelling, these stories are not identical to the way they are presented earlier. So that already, the idea of what I would call a camera two, a different perspective on the story, will yield details that will help us better understand the story that we had read before, right? Share a different angle, a different set of perspectives, which will also help us better understand sometimes famous statements of our sages that when we only try to understand them through the prism of one set of psukim, it gets very confusing. That's number one, right? Just the mere fact of a new perspective. Number two is this is the perspective of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? The Devarim is largely the set of final addresses, the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, the messages that he is going to impart. So when we go through familiar stories, the Meraglim, the sin of the golden calf, the giving of the Torah on Har Sinai, now not only is it a new perspective, it is a very personal perspective. It is Moshe Rabbeinu telling us how he experienced the events. Thirdly, that Moshe Rabbeinu is presenting these in a specific context, right? This is his last will and testament to a new generation, right? A generation that grew up with him, a generation that did not know the experience of the Exodus, the giving of the Torah, etc., except perhaps the most pediatric of perspectives. And what we are hearing is not just a new perspective, not only Moshe's perspective, but a perspective that he specifically wants to tailor present his message in a way that is going to be meaningful for a new generation with new opportunities and new challenges, right, on the cusp of entering Eretz Yisrael. So one of the first stories that we see repeated in Sefer Devarim is the story of the Meraglim, of the spies, which is quite understandable, right? The Jewish people are now essentially in the same position, right? They are about to enter Eretz Yisrael. And the question of will they go in an atmosphere of faith and courage and the idea that Hashem will be with them, when we know that perspective did not serve Bnei Yisrael well at the time of the Meraglim, right? They weren't able to access that level of faith, and that led to the disaster of the story of the Meraglim. So if we go back to the original story of the Meraglim, the story begins by Yidaber Hashem Moshe Limor. Hashem said to Moshe, saying, "Shlach lecha anashim ve'asur eretz Canaan." Right, send out men, right, and they will tour Eretz Yisrael, which I'm going to give to the Jewish people. Now, it sounds like at the surface, right, that Hashem directly commanded Moshe. Right, Moshe said, "Go send people." However, some of you may be familiar with the famous Rashi in Sefer Bamidbar, that Rashi says that this was optional, right? We go back, the words are shlach lecha, right? Send for yourself. So Rashi there says, Ein ani mitzaveh, ani eini mitzaveh lecha. I'm not commanding you, right? I'm just telling you that if you have if you want, you can send these people. Lefi shabo Yisrael omer nishlachan Hashem lefanenu k'ma shenemar v'tikruni like kulchem. He says, really, this was at the behest of the Jews. And he quotes the psukim, not from here, but from Devarim, which we'll see in a moment. Now, it seems that this turns, if all we are looking at is the psukim over here, the idea of shlach lecha, send for yourself, being optional, right, is not consistent with what we know of other places in the Torah, right? Moshe is told, right, aseh lecha, right, make for yourself, right, trumpets, and Aaron and so forth. Those are not optional, right? Avram Avinu is told, Lech lecha, right? Go for yourself. Again, that is a direct mitzvah from God. It's a little unusual to say that in this story over here, Shlach lecha is optional. However, right, it is intriguing that when we come to the story that we will read this Shabbos, right, there it absolutely begins, that you all approach me. And they said, let us send people, vayashivu zanu davar es haderech asher na'aleva, ve'es ha'arim asher navo elihen. Right, and they'll tell us the road that we will take to get there, as well as the cities that we will come to them. Right, and then they come back, right, and they give their report. Right, and again, here it is. And they decide they are not going to do it. So the question is, what happened? Right? Is this a divine order, or is it something Bnei Israel devised on their own? So Rabbi Yaakov Midan has this is an old question, right? How do we synthesize these two stories? So Rabbi Midan makes a fascinating suggestion in his Sefer Bamidbar. He says that there are really two agendas here. Right? The pasuk of Shlach Lecha Hashem is indeed a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah over there? The mitzvah is to send people out, but for what purpose? They are, again, remember that it is 12 people, right? Representatives of each shevet. So he says, why would you do that? And the point of that is a military assessment of what's going to happen, which is exactly, by the way, what happens when Yoshua, a generation later, he sends 2 spies, right, to go and see what's happening. Rabbi Dan says you don't send 12 spies, right? That's not, spies need to be able to keep a low profile, right? They need to fit in, right? You don't send a delegation of 12 people for spying. So he says, why did they send 12 people? Because the agenda, as far as God commanded Moshe, was something a little bit different. What was that agenda? The agenda was the process of nachala, right, of apportioning Eretz Yisrael to all of the constituent tribes, was about to take place, right? And the tribal leaders were there to go and see the land, right? And he says the details there are not details that are primarily military, right? The goal of the mitzvah of God, stand in the heads of the shvatim, look at the land, and again, at that point, perhaps decide which is the land, which is most appropriate for their specific tribes, right? And to see, is it wooded, is it not wooded, what kind of cities are there ready for the apportioning, and so forth. That was the mitzvah, right? It was a way of engaging the nachala, right? The process of inheriting Eretz Yisrael, which of course is done by tribes. Good. That's, he says, when devarim comes in. That the people, right, said, we need to make a strategy over here, right? We need to know militarily, right? And that already is the beginning of the breakdown. Instead of, again, remember, this is still the generation led by, pillars of fire and clouds of glory, right? And again, at that stage, the Jewish people was going to certainly be able to miraculously conquer had they gone in at that point. Again, if you remember last week, we spoke about the idea of the Netziv, right? That something happened, right, as a result of the events at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, that now, instead of a miraculous Hanhaga, right, instead of them entering Eretz Yisrael with open miracles, right, kind of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that now we find ourselves in a new reality, right? And what's the new reality? The new reality is they're going to have to do it in a military way and trust that God is with them. So the Rabbi Dan's reconstruction is what Moshe does is he tacks on, right, this military spying mission to the tribal agenda that God had actually commanded him. And he says that is the beginning of the mistake, right? Tribal representatives, right, are not experts in military strategy, right? They don't have a role to play, right? What that wound up doing is creating a false empowerment, right? That then they came back and they gave this terrible report, and that was the beginning of the disaster of Chet HaMeraglim. what's interesting, right, is that another detail that we only see over here, right, is that it implies here, right, that Moshe's non-entry into Eretz Yisrael, right, was also a result, right, of one second. It says, "Gam bi hisanav Hashem bilgalcham lemor." Right, God get angry at me also. Right, and the idea again, in the frontal telling of the story, we don't hear anything that Moshe is going to have consequences for this. Right, again, because perhaps Moshe's role, right, was relatively minor, right, compared to the sin of the nation as a whole. But here, where Moshe is telling us, now we have a new detail, right? That Moshe, because he did not catch, right, the desire of the people to change the original divine mission, right, of Nachala, right, and add this element of espionage that was not appropriate at this juncture, that opened up the door for everything that would go wrong. So I think this is, I hope over the course of the next couple of weeks, we can look at a number of these episodes to try to understand what new information we can garner, what new perspective we can gain from Moshe Rabbeinu's retelling of these incidents. A good Shabbos to all.